Well, good morning. It's 8:05 on a Thursday of the summer. While most of you are asleep, I'm making videos. We're now going to use the object selection tool. And to use this, all you have to do is draw a rough selection around the object you want to select, and the object selection tool identifies the object and creates a tight selection for it. For an object that has a complicated outline, such as the coral, the object selection tool will typically be much faster than trying to draw that irregular outline by hand. So we're going to select the object selection tool, which is right here, object selection tool, and then drag a selection around the piece of coral. It doesn't have to be precise or centered. What's important is that it's relatively tight selection with a small amount of space between the coral and the edges of the selection marquee. You're simply showing Photoshop which object that you want to select. So I'm just gonna, I don't have the object selection tool done. Now, there we go. A colored highlight might appear over an object when you hover over it with the object selection tool. The highlight indicates it's automatically identifying a potential selection. If the area you want to select is highlighted, just click it. So the object selection tool analyzes the area inside the rectangular section, finds the object, and creates a selection marquee along its complicated edge. It did highlight. See when you move it over something how it highlights. So we're going to select the move tool. And we're going to drag the coral to the area of the shadow box labeled B, positioning it so the shadow appears to the left and below the coral. And we want to make sure that little B is covered up. But you see there's a little shadow to the left and below. See the shadow. That's how we want to do it. You can choose select, deselect, or command D to unselect it, or just click away with it with the selection tool. All of those will work. And that's how you use the object selection tool. If your object selection tool creates a selection that's too tight, you can choose select and then modify and expand. And enter a pixel value. Usually 1 to 3 is enough. As with other selection tools, you can add missed bits to the selection by holding down the shift and then dragging the tool around the missed parts. Or you can subtract from the selection by holding down the Alt key on Windows or the Option key on a Mac as you drag the tool around the area to remove. I'm going to cancel that because ours is fine. I'm going to do Command D to deselect it. So we're now going to, this next one's a little tricky. It was tricky for me. It may not be tricky for you. We're going to work on this plate that's down here. So let's zoom in on this plate so we can see it pretty good. Make it at least 100%. If you want to make it more, you can. So you can move selections, reposition them as you create them, and even duplicate them. In this section, you're going to learn several ways to manipulate selections. Most of these methods work with any selection. You'll use them here with the elliptical marquee tool, which lets you select ovals or perfect circles. One of the most useful ways you may find in this selection is introduction of modifier keys that can save you time in arm motions. Selecting ellipses and rectangles can be tricky. Well, we saw that I just used it to select that plate a minute ago and it worked pretty good, but this tool is going to be tricky. You may have to try several times to get it to work. We're going to learn 2 important keyboard mouse combinations that can make Photoshop your Photoshop work much easier. As you perform this exercise, be careful to follow the directions about keeping the mouse button or specific keys pressed. If you accidentally release the mouse button at the wrong time, you're just going to have to start that little exercise over again. All right. So we got the select tool, the zoom tool. We're zoomed in on it, so we're going to select the elliptical marquee tool is what we are going to use here. And we're going to move the pointer over the plate of shells, and we're going to drag it diagonally across the oval plate to create a selection, but do not release the mouse button. It's okay if your selection does not match the plate shape yet. You don't have to include every pixel on the plate of shells, but the selection should be the shape of the plate and should contain the shells comfortably. If you accidentally release the mouse button, just draw it again. In most cases, including this one, the new selection will replace the previous one. So we're going to click and we're going to drag down, and you see this oval is kind of weird. It doesn't really fit. I'm still holding down the mouse. Now I'm going to hold the space bar and continue to drag the selection. Instead of resizing the selection, now you're moving it. So we're moving it with the space bar. Now I'm coming over again and we're dragging this mouse. We're moving it down. Ooh, that's pretty good. I did pretty good on that. Not great. It would have been much easier to use the tool we just used, but we're learning new things. So the technique of holding down the spacebar to reposition as you draw also works with other drawing tools, such as the shape tools and the pen tool. When the selection border is positioned appropriately, release your mouse button. If you want to resize a selection after releasing the mouse button, you can do select and then transform selection, and that does this. And so from there, if I wanted to make this a little bit bigger, I can do that. So just a tip for you. And once you're done with it, you would click the check box or enter. Let's choose view and then fit on screen. Leave the marquee tool selected and active for the next thing we're going to do. We're going to now use a keyboard shortcut to move the selected pixels onto the shadow box. The shortcut temporarily switches the active tool to the move tool, so you don't need to select it from the tools panel. Remember before when we moved these things, we just selected the move tool, clicked and drug it. We're going to show you a different way. All right. So with that elliptical marquee tool still selected, you're going to press, if you're on a Windows computer, you're going to press Control. If you're on a Mac, you're going to press Command and hover the pointer within the selection. So the pointer icon now indicates a pair of scissors, indicating that the selection will be cut from its current location. While continuing to hold down the Control or Command key, drag the plate of shells onto the area of the shadow box labeled C. And we're going to use another technique to nudge the oval plate into exact position in just a second. So drag it up here and make sure it's still selected, but don't deselect the plate. You can make minor adjustments to the position of selected pixels by using the arrow keys. You can nudge the selection in increments of 1 pixel or 10 pixels. 1 pixel or 10 pixels. You'll hear that or see that again. So now, you're going to use the arrow keys. Before you begin, make sure the plate of shells is still selected in the document window. We're going to select the Move tool now. And using the arrows, press the arrow up key. See how it's moving it up? Those are in increments of 1. Experiment by pressing other arrow keys to see how they might affect the selection. If you hold down the Shift key, and press the arrow, and it moves it in increments of 10 pixels. So you can do 1 or 10. Selection edges, guidelines, and other visible items that aren't actual objects are called extras. So another way to hide the selection edge is to select the View Extras command or press the keyboard shortcut Control H or Command H. Sometimes the selection marquee can distract you as you make adjustments. You can hide the edges of a selection temporarily without actually deselecting, and then display the selection border once you've completed the adjustments. So to do this, if you'll click View, Show, and then Selection Edges, you see how it's checked now. We're going to click on it, and now you see it's still selected. We just can't see the edges. So you can see that I can still move it around without having that. And then when you're done and have it, then you're just going to go back to View, Show, and do Selection Edges again, so you can see your edges. Choose Select, Deselect, or Control D or Command D. We're going to unselect it. We're going to click File and then Save. I want to talk to you about one other thing that you're going to learn more about later, but there's a quiz question involved with what I'm about to tell you. So to softening the edges of a selection. To smooth the hard edges of a selection, you can apply anti-aliasing or feathering, or use the select and mask option. Anti-aliasing smooths the jagged edges of a selection by softening the color transition between edge pixels and background pixels. Since only the edge pixels change, detail loss is minimal. Anti-aliasing is useful when you cut, copy, and paste selections to create composite images. Like we just used this elliptical tool. You see anti-alias right here. That was checked, so we were using that, even though you didn't know you were using it. If you're on the object selection tool, you'll notice that is not there. Anti-aliasing is available for the lasso, polygonal lasso, magnetic lasso, elliptical marquee, and magic wand tools. So if you were to select those tools, you would see its option in the options bar. To apply anti-aliasing, you have to select the object or the option before making the selection. Once a selection is made, you can't add anti-aliasing to it. Feathering blurs edges by building a transition at the boundary between the selection and its surrounding pixels. This can blur detail at the edge of the selection. You can define feathering for the marquee and lasso tools as you use them, or you can add feathering to an existing selection. Feathering effects become apparent when you move, cut, or copy the selection. To feather a selection edge, using the Select and Mask option, you would make a selection. So let's do this. Let's just make a selection just to show you this. Select and Mask option up here, and it opens this up here, over here. You see this, you have all these things, and we're going to use this later. This is just to let you know about it now. You can smooth the outline, feather it, or contract or expand it. All those things are done over here. To anti-alias a selection edge, select the lasso tool or elliptical marquee or magic wand tool and select anti-alias in the options bar to define a feathered edge. For a selection you're about to draw, select any of those lasso or marquee tools, enter a feather value in the options bar. This value defines the width of the feathered edge and can range from 1 to 250 pixels. To define a feathered edge for an existing selection, you would choose Select, Modify, and then Feather. I don't have anything selected, so let me cancel that. You would go Select, Modify, and Feather. And from there, you can enter a value for the feather radius, and then you would click OK. All right, that's a long video.